Sure.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So yeah, welcome to the online seminar series of Mathematical Foundation on Data Science. So our seminar series is generously sponsored by 2 Sigma. And today we are extremely happy to have our distinguished speaker, Professor Adam Wierman from Caltech. Professor Adam Wierman is a professor at the Computer Science in the Department of Computing and Mathematical Sciences at Caltech. So he is known for his work in different fields such as scheduling, heavy tails, green computing, queuing theory, and algorithmic game theory. So he received many awards such as NSF Career Award, ACM Sigmatrix Rising Star Award, and he has received many Best Paper Awards in different fields, say in ACM Sigmatrix, IEEE Infocom, among many others. And his work has also made a great impact in real world. So for example, an extension of his work was used in HP's Net Zero data center architecture, and which was named a 2013 Computer World Honors Laureate. And his work also received other awards such as 2014 IEEE William Bennett Prize. So today, Professor Wierman will talk about competitive control via online optimization. So please join me in welcome Professor Wierman.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. As I was saying before, I think these virtual seminars are, one of the bright spots of this world we find ourselves in, that we can exchange ideas so easily across lots of different groups at lots of different schools. And so I've really enjoyed attending this one. So today's talk is an example of what's been an emerging, rich and impactful field at the, that's kind of being called these days learning and control. So the interface of, online learning and these sorts of tools with adaptive control. And, I wanted to say a little bit about that before jumping into the specific results I presented. And, this field is, I think, particularly exciting right now because of the complementary philosophies that underlie learning and control as 2 fields that have both been, extremely successful individually. In the learning area, you have this kind of approach to go from data to action, often in a model-free way, and you mitigate the uncertainty you're facing in an application, robotics or autonomous systems or things like this, by learning from the past, as opposed to the more traditional control theoretic view where you go from model to action rather than directly from data to action, and you're focused on mitigating uncertainty via feedback. And kind of when you sort of take this cartoonish view of these fields, it's really clear that while both philosophies have been successful, there's a huge opportunity to combine them and to use both kind of learning from past data to mitigate uncertainty in combination with feedback. And this is, I think, what makes this so exciting as an approach for having kind of guaranteed learning in a data-driven fashion going forward when we look at autonomous systems broadly defined. And so, around this field, there's now, been an enormous number of conferences and workshops kicking off. L4DC is a really exciting venue for publishing work in this area or for getting exposed to work in this area if you haven't seen it before. And then, just like the virtual seminar where we are today, there's an exciting virtual seminar on Wednesdays that focuses specifically at this on this field of, learning and control meets learning. And so I encourage you to pay attention to those talks as well. I think there's been some overlap in our speakers, actually. So I think that it's not too far afield from what you're here today. If you're interested in this seminar, you're probably interested in that too. And so I think there's been a lot of different sorts of work and different driving questions at this intersection between learning and control, but I wanted to highlight a few that I think have kind of really taken hold in the community about ways to approach or questions that are driving that intersection, kind of from the most obvious to the most general. So the first one here is kind of what you first think of when you start to think of how to combine learning and control, which is how can you take predictions from some learning model and integrate them into autonomy? And so this, if you think of canonical policies like model predictive control, this would say, how can you take learning tools and integrate them into the predictions that you're using for things like model predictive control. And by doing this, can you generalize where you can use these techniques to, help them be more effective in time-varying models, or models with delayed observation, or model error, places where there are model error, et cetera. And so that's been a really important direction at this interface. Another important direction at this interface that's kind of on the more analytic side is to say, ML tools and analysis, especially in online learning, has been really effective in providing adversarial bounds, finite time single trajectory bounds, bounds that apply for very general loss functions, and things like this. And these are all areas where on the control side, it's been more difficult to get results of that form. And so there's this idea that has been really popular of how can you take these machine learning tools, regret analysis, competitive analysis, these sorts of things, and apply them to control models to get improved robustness and improved generalization around these things. And so adversarial bounds and general loss bounds, things like this, but in the control theoretic setting. And so that's those two are actually basically kind of a superset of what I'll talk about today. So I'll give you an example of kind of one line of work that connects to these things in the talk. But then maybe the most general view of what this kind of interface is trying to do is to try to say, how you can combine the model-free and model-based perspectives to get the best of both worlds. And so here, one way to phrase that is to think of it as how much do you need to understand about a system to control it? Maybe you don't need a super detailed model, maybe a little bit is enough to kind of get the benefits of model-free, and then combine that with what you can do with, the benefits of model-based approach, but then combine that with model-free. And so, is this a way that we can bring scalability and robustness by imposing just a bit of model information to things like RL? And so this I think I won't talk about today, but I did want to highlight a little bit of work from our group that has been going after this question directly in recent years, led by Guanan and Yiheng, with Nali and Longbo and Chenkai as collaborators as well. And so here, two examples of that kind of make this vague goal a little bit more concrete are the following. So the first is in the area of multi-agent RL. And so here, if we think about, using multi-agent RL, it's often extremely difficult to get, provably scalable designs for multi-agent RL without some sort of model structure being imposed. And what we've been able to do is try to look at how you can exploit a very simple kind of model structure to be able to provably have scalable RL. And here the model structure we're imposing is sort of the sort of correlations, the dependencies in the model decay as you move further away in the network. And so with this kind of locality in the dependency structure, you're able to get provably scalable multi-agent RL in these networked environments with a variation of or what we call scalable actor-critic approaches. And we've been applying this in a couple of applications. This graph is an illustration of it in the wireless context, connecting to my old life in networking. I think it's an exciting new direction, and that we've been pushing, and we can now handle time-varying networks and a wide array of rich network models by imposing a little bit of structure on what is a model-free approach at its heart. And technically, the work here, I think, is pretty exciting because it also, the analysis that we do focuses on stochastic approximation, and actually as a byproduct leads to finite time analysis for Q learning and TD learning with state aggregation and some sort of more traditional RL models like that. So that's one example of model structure, the network model being imposed and that being enough to get scalability. Another example that kind of hits at this point is on the control side more directly, where this is motivated by our work in smart grid and power systems, where often in power systems you have an inherently nonlinear system, but you today control it with a linear model. And so in some sense, there's a linear approximation of the dynamics that's reasonably good, even though the underlying system is nonlinear. And the question is, for systems like that, where there's a linear approximation, but the system is nonlinear, can you combine the control you get from the linear approximation with model-free tools to be able to get provably better performance? And so here, is an example of this in a simple case of an inverted pendulum, where if you were to use the linear approximation, you'd get a cost according to this black line. If you were to use a straight model-free approach, a straight policy gradient approach, you'd eventually do better, but it would take a lot of iterations, a lot of data to get there. Whereas if you combine the two, you sort of use the model-based approach as a smart warm start for a model-free approach, you reduce the variance dramatically, and you in a very small amount of data can get a performance better than you would with a model-free approach alone. And not only does this work empirically, we can prove that this works. And so what you end up with is a provably convergent policy gradient approach for nonlinear systems that are well approximated by an underlying linear dynamic. And so those are meant to be kind of advertisements for papers rather than full details, but they kind of highlight what you're after when you're looking for ways of combining model-free and model-based approaches to get the best of both worlds, and what sort of ways you can impose a little bit of model structure or approximate model structure, but still get proofs about policy gradient or about model-free approaches, in that context. And so that's kind of the more general thing, but what I'll talk about today is more related to those first topics, where the goal is to say, how can we use techniques and algorithms and policies from the learning world to get insights into the control context and build that connection and deepen that connection directly. And we'll look at that today in a very specific domain, which is online optimization, and how that connects to adaptive control, specifically control of linear systems. Okay, so the model that we're looking at, the version of online optimization that we'll talk about, is a little different than the sort of most classic version of online optimization that you might be aware of. It's online optimization with a switching cost. And so I'll explain it with a cartoon here, where suppose you're starting off at x0, some action within the action space, and then at each round, what happens is you're presented with a cost function. You choose a new action to do well on that cost function. You pay the cost on that cost function. But then in addition to paying the hitting cost, I'll call it, for that cost function, you pay an additional cost, which is based on how much you move. So you can think of that cost as a norm of the distance, the distance between your actions, but more generally, it can just be an arbitrary cost of x1 and x2. And so the hitting cost and the switching cost. And this means that you kind of want to hedge potentially, like maybe you don't want to move all the way to the minimizer, like I showed here. You're stopping a little bit short of the minimizer because you'd pay an extra switching cost to go all the way to the minimizer, and you want to balance those two. And so that's the high level idea. And then, this happens again, you get a new hitting cost, you choose a new action, you get your cost there plus your cost to move, and so on. And the key thing here, the key challenge is that without knowing the future cost functions that are going to come, you don't know whether to switch or not, or how far to switch or not. So like in this example of these three cost functions, what you should have done is move immediately to this green dot and then never move again, because then you're kind of at the minimizer of the first function. You haven't given up too much compared to the minimizer of the second function, and you again haven't given up too much compared to the minimizer of the third function. So you pay a movement cost once, and then you don't pay a switching cost ever again, and you're still near the minimizers. But you can't know how to do that without knowing the future cost functions. And so understanding how to balance the movement cost with the hitting cost is the algorithmic challenge here. And I've kind of isolated that challenge because I'm giving the learner knowledge of the cost function in the round. That's not necessarily needed, but that sort of isolates the hardness of the knowing when to switch. You can still get results if you take that away and you say you don't get to observe the cost function until after you make your choice. Okay, so that's the core of it, and just summarizing it on one slide, it's an online model, so you see the cost and then you choose your action each round. The overall cost you experience is the sum of the hitting and the switching each round. And your goal is to minimize the cost over time without knowing future costs. And your kind of bar for doing well that we focus on in this talk is adversarial. So we're going to look at the competitive ratio, where you look at the ratio of your cost versus the cost of a offline algorithm that knew all of the switching, all of the hidden costs, all the CT, for the whole horizon before making its first choice. And so the all-knowing offline optimizer is what you're trying to compare against. And just as a contrast, since maybe the more common metric to think about in these online algorithms world, at least in the learning context, is regret. So there, the traditional view of regret is that you're comparing against in an additive way against the static optimal instead of the offline optimal, where the static optimal is, again, solving this problem with complete knowledge, but not having this T, so that you're just looking at a static action over the horizon rather than a dynamic action over the horizon. Of course, there are variations of regret, dynamic regret, that look at more, richer bars for comparison, so richer optimal algorithms. But for this talk, let's stick to the classic idea of regret as the static optimal. And so that's the key difference, not the additive difference. And then the other key here is that we're thinking of the costs as being adversarial. So there's somebody that's trying to punish you by choosing costs that are going to make you perform bad. Okay, so we got introduced to this actually in the introduction. You mentioned sustainable data centers. That's why we first looked at this model. So this model for us captured the idea of, can we run a data center on entirely renewable sources, which seems impossible because of the stochasticity and the unpredictability of renewables. But to do this, it requires dynamic right sizing of capacity. And so that's the XT, what sort of capacity you have active and in different power saving modes. And smart deferral of workloads. When do you run particular workloads, which the time varyingness of arrivals, the time varying of renewables captures the cost functions that are varying over time in an unpredictable way. And the key thing is predicting renewables, predicting workloads is hard. So you do have this kind of online information that you're facing. And the thing that maybe isn't obvious is the switching cost is really crucial, because switching into and out of deep power saving modes creates an enormous wear and tear on the hardware. And so if you balance that wear and tear cost over its lifetime, and in terms of the reduction of lifetime with the dollar values of kind of energy and performance, then you basically have a break-even point of leaving your server in a deep power saving mode for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours. And so you have to kind of know that you can leave it in that deep state for a few hours before it's worth it to turn it off, but you can't do that without being able to predict the future. And so that's the inherent challenge of this that's captured by the online optimization framework that I introduced. And so, as he said, the algorithms we developed actually led to, a real product that we deployed and works very well in practice. But that was just the starting point. At this point, this kind of online optimization with switching costs is a core model in a wide array of problems in energy systems, from online optimal power flow to idling of cars to demand response. And one that is, I think, to give a little plug for a project that Stephen Lowe and Zach Lee are doing at Caltech, one that's of particular interesting is adaptive electric vehicle charging, where you adapt the rate of charging based on the arrival of cars, the availability of solar energy, the price of electricity in the market. And you do this adaptively over the time that the cars are there, while ensuring they get the charge needed before they're going to leave. And so this is a very important problem. And Zach and Stephen run a test bed at Caltech that we actually run these algorithms on. Actually, when pre-COVID, we ran it on many cars every day. Post-COVID, there's not too many cars coming into campus anymore. But it's a really interesting problem. And here the key reason for the switching costs is, again, the wear and tear on the battery. If you're changing the rate too frequently, you're going to damage the batteries, and people are going to be less likely to use your system. So you have to be very respectful of that. And so the switching costs are crucial. And if you're interested in this area, there's a very nice public data set that Zach has released. And a very nice simulator that Zach has worked on based on these as well. So it's very easy to test algorithms eventually we hope to be able to actually have a live test bed where you can test algorithms on the cars in the garage in a plug and play way, but that's not available yet. But the algorithms that have been developed so far are at the heart of a startup that was recently acquired by EDF Renewables in this space as well. Outside of energy, there's lots of applications too. So again, giving a plug for other people's work, Yisung Yu at Caltech has been using this kind of framework where switching costs are crucial in facial animation and robotic planning. I really like the facial animation one. So this is in partnership with Disney. And here the hitting cost is the shape of the mouth that you're trying to animate to the speech. So because of the phonemes, the shape that the mouth should be in to make a particular sound. But you can't just have it move jerkily from one shape to the next. You have to have the mouth move smoothly when you're doing the animation in an automated way. And so that smoothness in the animation is captured by the switching cost. And so it's really, again, a hitting cost for the shape, a smoothing cost for smooth movement, and it captures that application very nicely. Robotic planning is another great application that Yisung did, and this is actually a pointer to an article in Sports Illustrated about his work there, where again the idea is if you're managing a camera for the NBA, you want the basketball to be in the middle of the screen or nearby the middle of the screen. That's your hitting cost, the distance from the middle that you're tracking. But you can't have the camera move jerkily, so you need a switching cost to capture that regularization to ensure smooth movement of the camera. Video streaming, SOCO type algorithms are now kind of in standards. We've been working with some finance companies about portfolio optimization, and autonomous vehicles are a nice fun one as well. That you can do lots of demos here. And here I'll use this to kind of highlight kind of the core that underlies a lot of these, which is in some sense that the hitting cost captures some sort of tracking problem. And so here, if we think of landing a drone, so this was just a simple one-dimensional illustration, but we think of landing a drone, then xt is the altitude. You have some rate that you're trying to track, or some trajectory that you're tracking as you're landing. That's your theta. You have some, trajectory loss here, and then you have kind of smoothness in the altitude. You can't move too quickly up or down as you're following the trajectory. And so the switching cost guarantees the smoothness. So that's kind of a very high level motion planning example to give you something concrete to hold in your head for the talk. And so from all these applications, as you can imagine, there's tons of variations about what the switching cost looks like, what the hitting costs look like, what sort of constraints you put on the action space, depending on what you're kind of capturing. And there's lots of papers in this space looking at lots of these variations, especially as you add constraints, the problem gets considerably harder. We're not going to talk about constraints in this seminar today, but I'd be happy to talk about that to anybody who's interested afterwards. But coming back to the motivation of this talk in terms of connecting online optimization to control, one thing that's crucially missing from what I've talked about so far is there's no dynamics. And so if we think of that tracking, that drone problem where you're doing motion planning, at the high level you can just talk about controlling the altitude, but that's not really very implementable at that level because you don't directly control the altitude. You control the altitude through the dynamics, so you control it through the acceleration. And so you have a dynamics that's capturing how your control impacts the acceleration, and then the state, that the x of t is a function of that dynamics. And your control cost is crucial, of course. And so, this is a more kind of low-level problem. And when you're thinking about the low-level control, you need the dynamics, and that's missing from SOCO. And so, when we think of the control version, what you could have in a canonical way is, a linear dynamical system like this, where there's dynamics that are governing, your control, that are connecting your control to the state. And then there's a cost that looks like this, except the switching cost kind of maps into now a control cost. And like before, your algorithm, your goal is to stabilize and then minimize control. And while control theory often focuses on stabilizing, the interactions with learning kind of move the focus to minimizing cost. And there's a huge and growing literature in recent years pushing the design of no regret algorithms and competitive controllers for this kind of linear dynamics. And one of the goals of that type of community is to take, what are traditional results about stochastic noise and convert them to worst case adversarial results, and to take results that focus on quadratic costs and push them to more general costs, and to get these sorts of adversarial and more general results via learning techniques in this area. And so, one motivating example for this for us that I'll come back to a little bit because I'm particularly excited about it is in the energy space, where the goal is to do frequency regulation, but do frequency regulation in cases where there's high renewable penetration. And one of the big challenges that comes from high renewable penetration is that the inertia in the system, which is typically a result of conventional generation, goes away or gets reduced as you have more and more renewables, and that inertia is crucial to stability and crucial to operation of the grid. And so when you have frequency dynamics in these systems with renewables, the inertia, which used to be stable and dependable, now varies with time depending on the availability of renewable energy, and you end up with a linear dynamical system that has time varying A and B. And so that adds a huge amount of complexity, and here, because of the time varying AOT, you really depend on adversarial results about how you're handling this time variation, because stability is crucial and minimizing cost is crucial here, and renewables create an extra challenge because of the time variation. So I'll come back at the end and show you that all the theory that I'll develop works very well in this context. Okay, so that's the motivation of, we have SOCO on one hand, we have linear dynamical systems on the other, and one of the goals is to understand how we can connect these two. And as I said, there's been a large and growing literature with a lot of great people working on it that seeks to use learning tools in the context of control and design no regrets and competitive algorithms there. And I think that's been a really exciting area. And part of that area has been kind of asking the question of, we can use these tools there, and it seems like there's a lot of parallel analysis, parallel results, parallel ideas that apply in both contexts. And one of the underlying sort of theoretical questions has been why. Why is it so successful to take learning on the one side, ideas and tools, and use them in control? And this has been something that was bugging us in the group for quite a while, and we felt like there should be some sort of deeper connection that lets you kind of go in a rigorous way back and forth between these fields. And so we've been working on that, and others in other groups have been working on that too, in Sebastian Bubek's group and Anupam Gupta's group and beyond, and Elad Hassan's group and many others. And there's been a series of very nice papers that kind of gradually deepen that connection between online optimization and control. And this result that I state here is kind of just the most recent one of these that we're working on just recently. So I want to make sure that I give credit to many other people and the results before as well. But the result here that I'm just really excited about is that we can now actually prove a reduction from any LDS where A and B are in controllable canonical form, and show that such a problem is actually equivalent to an online optimization problem, where it's a little different than what I've described so far, where you have to add memory and delay to it. And so I know not everybody might know what controllable canonical form is, but just know that you can convert any controllable system into one that's in canonical form, and it basically gives you structure for the A and the B, where the stars here are kind of arbitrary non-zero entries, and there's ones in the B that match with those rows where there's non-zero entries in the A. And so this is kind of a rote conversion you can do to get into canonical form, and this helps us because then you can start from canonical form when you're doing the reduction. And then, the key thing here is memory and delay are added. And memory was first used by Elad Hassan's group in online optimization, and not motivated by a reduction, just motivated by the fact that it has a lot of importance in a wide variety of algorithmic problems. And delay, of course, is very important in control, feedback delay. But what I mean by those is memory captures the switching costs depending not just on one step previous, but on many more step previous, so on your memory length previous. And the delay means that instead of getting to see the cost function right away, you only get to see the cost function, say d steps after you make your action. So the delay in when you get to see the cost of your action. And so more concretely, if we think of the cartoon that I started with, what I mean by delay in our reduction is that you have a hitting cost form that you maybe get to know ahead of time, the C of t, but it's centered around its minimizer v of t, and the minimizer you only get to see, you only get to know k steps after you make your action. And so there's a delay in when you get full revelation about the hitting cost. And for memory, what I mean is that the switching cost depends not just on xt and xt minus 1, but on all the way back to xt minus p. Okay, and for the reduction, we use a specific form of memory where the memory is kind of linear in this previous actions. Okay, and so I'm not going to go into the reduction, it's a bit complicated, but one piece of the reduction that I think is really interesting is that memory in the reduction ends up corresponding to noise that kind of modifies the B, modifies the control, whereas delay ends up with noise that modifies the state. So you've got noise in one, state disturbances are what kind of correspond to delay, and input disturbances are what correspond to memory. And this is quite a nice kind of tie. Now this should be taken with a grain of salt because this might be a function of the way we did the reduction. But I think you do get insight, especially when you see the results, about what leads to more or less impact in your competitive ratio later on. And then something that's kind of hot off the presses that we're just have been working on in the last couple of weeks is that you can go even further, and if you have nonlinear switching costs, you can actually make the mapping to nonlinear dynamics. And so you can start to actually connect beyond linear dynamical systems to SOCO as well. Okay, so this is maybe a reasonable point to ask if there are any questions in the chat that I should address before I get into kind of the algorithmic part on how we solve SOCO.
Yeah, so it's fine. I think it's quite clear.
Okay, great. I'll keep going then. Thanks. Okay, so for the rest of the talk now, I've given you the connection between SOCO and control. And at this point, if I give you an algorithm that's competitive for SOCO, we immediately get a competitive control policy as a byproduct of it through this reduction. And so let's focus on SOCO now. And we'll start by ignoring memory and delay, and I'll add those in when we get to the last bit of the talk. And so, I feel like one thing that I've seen as I've given talks on this kind of online optimization with switching costs over the years is until you think about it a bit, it's hard to kind of understand exactly why the switching costs make things different than kind of the classical online learning setting. And so it's useful to start with just thinking about why the natural simple approaches don't work well. And to show why the natural approaches don't work well, we actually only need a very simple setting. So think of, the adversary is only going to choose one of two cost functions, either one that's linearly decreasing or one that's linearly increasing. And that's going to be enough already to show why things like greedy and gradient descent don't work. And so to see, greedy, what a greedy approach would do for these cost functions is whenever the adversary gives C1, it would choose 1 to, cost 0. Whenever an algorithm chooses, whenever the adversary gives C2, it would choose 0. And so, what could an adversary do against greedy? Well, the adversary would just alternate cost functions and have one that's very steep, one that's very shallow. And so the greedy algorithm would then switch back and forth between 1 and 0, 1 and 0 every round. So it would have a cost of t because it's moving 1 each round for t rounds. Whereas the optimal for such a sequence could just always choose 1 and then pay 1 whenever the adversary gave C1, or pay 0 whenever the adversary gave C1, and pay 1 over t whenever the adversary gave C2. And so always pay less no matter what the sequence than t times 1 over t1. And so the optimal is then order t better, so unboundedly better than greedy in this context. So greedy has trouble. And here, the key insight is once you have these switching costs, you can't just greedily follow the minimizer. You have to think of whether it's worth it to move that far to get to the minimizer. And so this is something new about this, and as compared with, say, online optimization without switching costs. The second, very natural thing to do here is gradient descent. We know gradient descent works well for regret in online optimization without switching costs. And here, you just take a step down in the gradient direction, depending on which cost function the adversary gives you. And so if we think about what will happen, you have the, cost function, maybe you start with C2, you choose your action, you gradually walk down. Whenever you cross over the switching points between the two cost functions, the adversary gives you the other one, you walk back down, and you kind of go up and down on this upper envelope of the cost functions before settling down at the crossover point, the minimizer of the upper envelope if you're gradient descent. And so that's really great because that point is the static optimal, right? If you were going to minimize the static choice against the offline against an adversary, this is how you would do it. And so you have regret, you have optimal regret in this context with gradient descent, but you can be very far from the dynamic optimal, because the dynamic optimal, the true optimal, is always going to switch between the endpoints if these cost functions are very steep. And so here, this is a situation where gradient descent is no regret, but it's unboundedly bad for competitive ratio because it's not kind of going to these endpoints. And so here, the insight is, again, the offline optimal, it's crucial to make big jumps. It's not enough to always make small jumps. You have to make big jumps if there's a big gain from a big jump. And you can really formalize this. And in some sense, little jumps in learning is crucial for regret. Big jumps are necessary for competitive ratio. And formalizing that intuition leads you to a result that says you can't be both sublinear regret, so regret that's lower order than t, and constant competitive ratio for this context. So there's no algorithm that can achieve both goals. You have to do something different algorithmically if you want to do well for regret than if you want to do well for competitive ratio. And for a lot of the applications that I talked about, for the ones that we've been focusing on, for example, in energy, competitive ratio is the right measure because you're controlling a dynamical system you want to compare to the dynamic optimal. And so you kind of we're in this region where simple things like gradient descent aren't good enough. And so many algorithms can be no regret for SOCO, but what we've been interested in is the question of, can an algorithm be constant competitive? And here the summary is that yes, finally in the last couple of years we've realized that you can, but it took a long time to get there. And so to give you some idea of that, when we started working on this, there were no competitive results. There were just regret analysis. And our first result was a competitive policy, but in the one-dimensional case, so where the action space, the x, was just one-dimensional scalar. And in that case, we were very happy that we could get a 3 competitive result. And then for the next 5+ years, people could push away at this, and there were increasing results in the one-dimensional case where you could push the competitive ratio down, eventually getting to 2, eventually showing that 2 was the best possible, and then kind of rethinking it as well with saying, well, we don't want complex algorithms, we want algorithms that are memoryless, don't look back in time, just make a decision based on the current state. And once you're using memoryless algorithms, 3 competitive is the best possible. And then Anupam Gupta's group was able to give a 3 competitive memoryless algorithm. And so there was a lot of work and very interesting theory done, but all in the one-dimensional case. During that whole time, I would kind of end my talks with a question like, can we move beyond one dimension? What's possible? Can we prove hardness results? And years passed with very little progress outside of one dimension. And at this point, we understand why, in large part thanks to the TCS world and connections that people like Sebastian Bubeck uncovered and Anupam Gupta's group uncovered to the convex body chasing problem. Where the key thing, and this was first done by Sebastian Bubeck, and then we extended it to involve predictions, where you can show that a specific example of online optimization called convex body chasing, if you're in a d-dimensional problem, you can never have a competitive ratio better than root d, even if the algorithm is forecasting perfectly for the next w steps. And so, there's this hard case that you can focus on. And the interesting thing is this reduction goes both ways. So if you have an algorithm for convex body chasing, you can solve general SOCO. And if you have a SOCO algorithm, you can solve convex body chasing. So what is the convex body chasing problem? So it's just like before, except now instead of a cost function, you just have a convex body that you're trying to move into. So, at every round, you're presented with a body, you have to move into that body, and then you pay a cost only about how far you moved. So basically, there's zero cost if you're in the body, there's infinite cost if you're outside of the body. And so you have to move into the body each round. And just like before, if you knew what bodies were coming, you could be really smart and kind of potentially even move into the overlap and only move once. But without knowing what bodies are coming, you can't make such strategic moves. You have to kind of be towards the centroid, and then potentially you're paying a big cost for that. So it's a similar issue, just kind of in the SOCO version, it basically corresponds to having hidden costs that look like this for the bodies. So this is hard, and you can see why it's hard, right? It's hard because you lose your smoothness, you lose your well-behavedness for the cost function. And so once you understand that, you realize, okay, well, maybe in general it's hard. And I should emphasize actually in the convex body chasing world, it's not just lower bounds. There's some really nice algorithms that can nearly achieve this root D at this point. In particular, Mark Selk has a beautiful algorithm for that context. But in terms of going after constant competitive ratio, the next step then becomes clear. It's in these applications, we have much more well-behaved structure. Can we take advantage of that structure to do well algorithmically, to get beyond this root D? And here, just I guess very recently, we were able to kind of achieve this and come up with an algorithm called regularized online balanced descent, ROBD, that achieves a constant competitive ratio. The crucial thing being there's no dependence on the dimension here. And in particular, further, it's for strong convex hidden costs, and the convexity parameter here is m. So if you think of m getting smaller, it's getting more and more like the body chasing. The problem is since the function is getting flatter and flatter, and in that context, you have a very bad competitive ratio. But as long as you have some steepness, then you do very well. And so this is kind of the main result here. And for us, this really felt wonderful to finally get this constant competitive result for the general dimensional version of the problem. And so, yeah, like I said, the key is no dependence on D. But of course, as soon as you see a result like this, the question is kind of what's achievable. Can you, is this the best one can hope for? In particular, this dependence on M, can you reduce that? And so you can actually prove lower bounds as well. And the interesting thing on the lower bound is you can show that this dependence on root M is tight. So you can prove a lower bound like this. But then you can actually push even further, and it really felt amazing when this worked out, because it's so rare to have exact constants matching for your algorithm in the lower bound, but you can actually match exact constants. So RBD not only is order optimal, but the constants are precisely those of the lower bound that we prove. And so you can't have better, even up to constant factors, in terms of the competitive ratio than ROBD achieves. So hopefully that motivates you to care what ROBD is. And so now let me explain what the actual algorithm is. And I'll start with the first version, which ignores the regularized. So this is just online balanced descent. And here it's nice to kind of compare this a little bit with gradient descent in a cartoon. So think this cartoon is, a particular hitting cost. The VT is the minimizer of the hitting cost for round T. Xt minus 1 is the action you played on the previous round. And these dotted lines are the level sets. And so, the key thing here is, if we were doing gradient descent, we'd be moving, orthogonal to where we are, the level set where we are, and we'd end up at some point. And I'd say one of the nice observations, the way to internalize why gradient descent is not necessarily the right thing to do in this context is, suppose gradient descent makes this move and ends up on this level set, then all of the points on this level set have the same hitting cost, but they don't all have the same switching cost. And in fact, there's one particular point that minimizes the switching cost, and it's this one. And so we could have the same hitting cost and a lower switching cost by moving projecting onto that level set, having, being orthogonal to where we land instead of orthogonal to where we started. And so, this is a, dominating improvement on that per step cost to do this instead of what gradient descent would do. And so this is the first idea in online balanced descent, is to pay attention to the geometry of where you're landing instead of the geometry of where you're starting. And this is, crucial when you're thinking about switching costs being important in these problems. The second idea is, how do you choose which level set you're going to end up? Well, you choose that in a way that balances hitting cost and switching cost, rather than choosing it according to some exogenous schedule of step sizes. And what I mean by that is, we're projecting onto a level set. Say that level set has cost L, and then that's then our hitting cost. So our hitting cost should be balanced up to a factor beta with the movement cost, the switching cost. And so if we choose the right level set to balance hitting cost and switching cost, and then we project onto it, that's online balanced descent. So I think this is a clean algorithm that kind of adds two ideas to the way we think about online gradient type algorithms, and both ideas are crucial when you're thinking of switching costs being important. But this isn't enough. So you can prove that just these two ideas only gets you to m to the 2/3, not root m. And so we need one more idea if we're going to match that upper bound. And so the key additional idea is to be greedy. And what do I mean by being greedy? I mean, from that point where we end with OBD, we're going to take a step directly towards the minimizer, and then our action is going to be the combination of those two. And so here, again, we're ignoring that geometry of kind of the intermediate level and saying we need to be a little bit kind of protectionist and go straight towards the minimizer. And this step is kind of because of the adversarial model, I'd say. So this step ensures that the adversary can't kind of run away from you and keep you always at the same distance. It is enough to sort of guarantee that you're always closing down the distance to where you should be in the optimal trajectory, and you're not being able to sort of have the adversary run away from you and keep you far away. And so this is why you have to be greedy towards where the minimizer is, rather than kind of doing anything towards that related to those local level sets of the cost function there. And the size of that depends on the smoothness of the cost function, that strong convexity parameter m. Okay, so that's greedy online balanced descent. But there's a challenge here, which is we're doing a projection step. That's not so easy. We're finding this balanced level set, which is again not so easy computationally. And so as stated, this you might worry about implementing this in an efficient way in a real system. And so there's an alternative view to this geometric view that we actually use, and this is what leads to regularized online balanced descent, where we view the action in a given round as the solution to this optimization problem, where the first two terms guarantee that you're projecting onto a level set, and the last term gives you something like this greedy step towards the minimizer by regularizing around the minimizer. And so this is what we actually mean by ROBD. And so it's computationally easier than the kind of geometric view. And this is what gives you that optimal constant in the theorem that I described. So this is another good point to stop and see if there are questions before going on.
It's very clear.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so then what's next? This is, our first order answer to without memory, without delay, the simplest, without any constraints, what can we do for online optimization? And so we can get a constant competitive, and the, I think, really nice thing is these results extend to delay and memory in a very natural way. So in the case of delay in memory, we have to change the algorithm with one little thing, which I'll explain in a second, is that we make it optimistic. I'll explain what that means. But once we do that, we get a competitive bound that looks like this. It's a little nastier, and it involves, but here now we directly, because of this result, get a constant competitive policy for linear dynamical systems with adversarial noise, just directly by having this result. And the key thing that you see is delay, the delay is this K. Delay hurts you exponentially. Memory isn't so bad, actually. So memory, this alpha parameter, is the sort of sum of the linear coefficients in the memory that we use for the previous P steps. And so it grows, but it's growing kind of linearly in memory. And it's not impacting you any sort of really nasty way in the competitive ratio. And so the impact memory is smaller. And if you think of the control context, remember delay corresponds to state disturbance. So disturbances in the state are really hard in terms of competitive adversarial results, at least via our reduction, whereas disturbances in input are less challenging, less negatively impact your performance, which I think is a nice intuition to take away from this result. Okay, and then I wanted to kind of give two examples of this now and sort of show how effective it is in the control context. So the first is this frequency regulation example where you have time varying inertia because of renewables. And if you use current designs, a change in renewable leads to kind of instability very quickly. Whereas, you can't even see our algorithm really because it's maintaining, strong stability here in this context. And so it's not affected by that time variation at all. And then this one is a sort of autonomous systems type example, like a drone trajectory tracking example. And you can see that, with predictions, you do really well, even with, this is the standard case, no delay, no predictions. But then as you give yourself delay, you get worse, but you still are able to track to the trajectory reasonably well, even with a very significant delay. Like not seeing the impact of your action until 5 steps later is a quite difficult problem for these online tracking problems. Okay, and so the last thing I want to do, if I have time, I'll do it very quickly, but I'll take time and still finish in an hour, is to say what I mean by, what's the new idea that lets you handle delay and memory. And so here, the new idea is to optimistically track what ROBD would do if it had full information. And so what I mean by that is, when we have delay, suppose we're trying to determine our action for xt. Because of delay, we haven't seen costs for anything in the last 3 steps. So we don't know what the real costs are for those steps if there's delay 3. But we do know before that. And so what we do for the algorithm is we compute what ROBD would do up until on all the information we know. And so if we're deciding xt, the new information we get is about cost t minus 3. And so we can now compute ROBD up to time t minus 3. So we run on ROBD on the observed costs. And then what we do for the rest is we do something that seems a little crazy. We figure out what cost functions would have been to minimize our cost. So what are the best cost functions the adversary could have given us if we want to minimize the cost of our actions? Then we pretend those cost functions arrived, and we compute what ROBD would have done on those cost functions. So we really kind of have a rose-colored glasses view of the world. Like this adversary, they're really our friend. They're going to give us the best cost functions that make us the happiest. We'll compute our actions as if we're running this with a friend, even though the friend is not a friend, right? And so that's what we do. We compute that trajectory, we get our new xt, that becomes our action. And then we repeat this. We get a new piece of information. We update our true trajectory of what ROBD would have done. We optimistically look at what the future holds if the adversary is our friend. We play that action. And this, is I think, surprising when you first hear about it, but actually somewhat natural approach in the following sense. So if you were to not be optimistic, if you were to be pessimistic, then you would be planning as if the adversary was going to make you do something crazy. And then if you plan in that way, you're probably incurring cost and movement because you're worried about hedging. And then if the adversary was nice to you, you incurred all this cost from moving, but the adversary played like the perfect world cost and had very little cost. And so you look really bad. And so you have to kind of play this optimistic strategy, because otherwise the adversary can, give a really easy cost function and you incurred unnecessary cost, and that hurts you in terms of the competitive ratio. And so that's kind of the intuition for why something like this can work well. Okay, so that's what I'll give. I'm not going to tell you how we prove it, but and the other thing I'm hiding a little bit under the rug is you need to do this recursively. So you can't compute the whole trajectory. You have to kind of first be optimistic and then pick the first step, then be optimistic again, pick the second step, then be optimistic again, and choose the third step. So you can't do it in one shot. You have to do it recursively for each step in the trajectory. Okay, so that's how you handle memory and delay. I'm not going to go into the details of how you handle other things, but you can also handle storage or inventory constraints, which is crucial for, say, electric vehicles. And to some extent, you can even handle non-convex costs in these models. We haven't been able to do that with memory yet, but if you take away memory, you can handle non-convexity in the cost as well. And something that I think is really important practically that I haven't talked about here is when you have predictions available to you, they certainly help, and we can prove competitive bounds on the impact of predictions as well in many cases. And so, but with that, I'm out of my hour. And so what I'm hoping that I got across is that, this area of online optimization with switching costs is exciting and rich and has lots of applications where there's been direct impact from the theoretical results. There's been a lot of progress in terms of algorithmic design, both in the no predictions case, which we talked about, but also in the predictions case. But there's also still a lot of open questions in all of these areas remaining. I think we're still in the infancy rather than the completion of this field. And so there's still lots of open questions. And one thing that I think is really interesting to keep exploring is this interplay between online optimization and control. And the reduction that I presented today is still kind of a baby step. There's a lot more that can be done to deepen that beyond the simple linear dynamical model to nonlinearities to general costs to all of these other settings. And I think there's going to be a lot of power if we can deepen that connections and understand when it's possible and when it's not possible to have a rigorous connection between online optimization and control. Okay, so with that, I'll stop. Here's a set of papers that are related to the results that I highlighted today, if you want to find the details. And thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great talk. So let's see the questions. The first question is, if nothing is adversarial in the control problem, can we do better?
Yes, definitely. So everything I focused on here is adversarial. If you have an underlying stochastic model, you should of course exploit it. There's some results like that in the online optimization world, many more in the control world. And I think the reduction kind of fails you a little bit in the stochastic case, because in the reduction, you're changing so much about one model to the other that kind of stochastic information doesn't translate in a nice way. So I think that in the stochastic world, at least so far, it seems to me that you kind of have to bring the technique over rather than depending on a reduction to connect the two.
Yeah. So yeah, so you mentioned about the predictions. So in your setting, I'm just curious. The prediction you get is a point prediction or distribution or
yeah, so the results that are most common in the online optimization side are point predictions, and most often exact predictions. So you have predictions of W steps ahead, and your cost function is parametric, and you get to know exactly the parameter for W steps, and you say how much does that help you, and the results that are proven tend to be of the form, your competitive ratio decreases at a rate of 1/W, or if you make kind of stronger assumptions, decreases exponentially in W as you have more information available. There's some work, we have I don't think I have the citation on the slide here, but there's some work that does look at kind of distribution, the impact of prediction error in this as well. But I'd say to a large extent, the results that include prediction error are qualitatively similar, and so there's a sense in which the focus has been on the exact prediction error, because that kind of gets at the heart of the matter without as much complexity in the analysis.
So the next question is, what can competitive ratio say about dynamic regret?
So yeah, so dynamic regret and competitive ratio, there's often a direct connection, but competitive ratio results are harder to prove typically because, for dynamic regret, you don't have to have as detailed a sort of characterization of the optimal. So you're looking at if you're looking at the true dynamic regret, then you're, basically looking at the additive version as opposed to the multiplicative version, and bounding the multiplicative version usually requires a little bit more understanding of the optimal than bounding the additive version. So it's a little bit harder to get them, but they often say a similar thing. The one caveat is, in some cases, even when you're looking at dynamic regret, you're limiting the class of policies that you're comparing against. And so there's some, for example, in the online control world, there's a lot of results that look at dynamic regret, but compare against the optimal linear controller as opposed to the optimal potentially nonlinear controller. And so oftentimes, when you're doing competitive ratio, you're really comparing against the optimal potentially nonlinear controller. And that's, I think, something to emphasize about the reduction here, is it lets you compare against the optimal nonlinear controller, which is hard to characterize in the control context, and so hard to compare against with regret.
Okay, so probably the last question is, can you say something more about the nonlinear control?
Yeah, so this is really off the presses, and the reduction, let's see if I can go back here, and I guess it's not too important to go back here too far, but the reduction, let me go all the way back to, here. So the way to do the reduction is you add a delta of xt minus 1 in this switching cost, and the form of that delta directly corresponds to the form of the nonlinear piece in the dynamics. And so the question going forward is, for what delta, what forms of nonlinear switching costs can you prove competitive ratios in the online optimization world? Because for those forms, you'll directly get a competitive ratio in the nonlinear dynamical systems world. And so, as we know, you can't hope to have for such a result to hold for every nonlinear form. And so what we have now is a way of going back and forth so that you can think about it as online optimization, which for me at least is often simpler to think about than thinking about it as a nonlinear dynamics. So it's really, a thing that we're working on right now. And so I hope that we can get some interesting forms where you can prove results in this context and then take them over to the control context.
Yes, yeah, great. Yeah, so we are running out of questions. Yeah, thank you again for the great talk. Yeah.
No, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions, everybody.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.